Easy English audiobook.
The Great Gatsby. Chapter 5. When I came home to West Egg that night, I was scared for a moment that my house was on fire. It was 2 o'clock, and the whole corner of the peninsula was bright with light. The light made the bushes look strange and made thin reflections on the roadside wires. Turning a corner, I saw that it was Gatsby's house, lit from top to bottom. At first, I thought it was another party, a wild game of hide and seek, or sardines in the box, with the whole house open for the game. But there wasn't a sound, only the wind in the trees blew the wires, making the lights flicker as if the house was winking in the darkness. As my taxi drove away, I saw Gatsby walking toward me across his lawn. "Your place looks like the World's Fair," I said. "Does it?" He looked at it absently. "I've been looking into some of the rooms. Let's go to Coney Island, old sport." "In my car." "It's too late." "Well, suppose we take a swim in the pool? I haven't used it all summer. I've got to go to bed." "All right." He waited, looking at me with eagerness. "I talked with Miss Baker," I said after a moment. "I'm going to call up Daisy tomorrow and invite her over here to tea." "Oh, that's all right," he said carelessly. "I don't want to trouble you. What day would suit you?" "What day would suit you?" He corrected me quickly. "I don't want to trouble you, you see. How about the day after tomorrow?" He thought for a moment. Then with reluctance, "I want to get the grass cut," he said. We both looked down at the grass. There was a sharp line where my ragged lawn ended and his darker, well-kept lawn began. I suspected he meant my grass. "There's another little thing," he said uncertainly and hesitated. "Would you rather put it off for a few days?" I asked. "Oh, it isn't about that. At least," he fumbled with his words. "Why," I thought. "Why, look here, old sport, you don't make much money, do you?" "Not very much." This seemed to reassure him, and he continued more confidently. "I thought you didn't, if you'll pardon me. You see, I carry on a little business on the side, a sort of sideline, you understand. And I thought that if you don't make much money, you're selling bonds, aren't you, old sport? Trying to. Well, this would interest you. It wouldn't take up much of your time, and you might make some nice money. It's a rather confidential sort of thing. I realize now that under different circumstances, that conversation might have been a big turning point in my life. But because the offer was obviously for a service to be done, I had no choice but to cut him off. "I've got my hands full," I said. "I'm much obliged, but I can't take on any more work." "You wouldn't have to do any business with Wolfsheim." He thought I was avoiding the connection mentioned at lunch, but I assured him he was wrong. He waited a moment longer, hoping I'd start a conversation, but I was too preoccupied. So he went home unwillingly. The evening had made me lightheaded and happy. I think I walked into a deep sleep as I entered my front door. So I don't know if Gatsby went to Coney Island or how many hours he looked into rooms, while his house stayed brightly lit. I called up Daisy from the office the next morning and invited her to come to tea. "Don't bring Tom," I warned her. "What? Don't bring Tom? Who is Tom?" she asked innocently. The day agreed upon was pouring rain. At 11 o'clock, a man in a raincoat dragging a lawnmower knocked on my front door and said Mr. Gatsby had sent him to cut my grass. This reminded me that I had forgotten to tell my maid to come back, so I drove into West Egg Village to find her among wet alleys and to buy some cups, lemons, and flowers. The flowers were unnecessary because at 2 o'clock, a greenhouse arrived from Gatsby's with countless vases. An hour later, the front door opened nervously, and Gatsby, in a white flannel suit, silver shirt, and gold tie, hurried in. He was pale, and there were dark signs of sleeplessness under his eyes. "Is everything all right?" he asked immediately. The grass looks fine, if that's what you mean. What grass? He asked blankly. Oh, the grass in the yard. He looked out the window at it, but judging from his expression, I don't think he saw anything. Looks very good, he said vaguely. One of the papers said they thought the rain would stop around 4. I think it was the Journal. Do you have everything you need for tea? I took him into the pantry, where he looked a little reproachfully at the maid. Together, we checked the 12 lemon cakes from the delicatessen. Will they do? I asked. Of course. They're fine, he said hollowly, adding, old sport. The rain slowed around 3:30 to a damp mist with occasional drops. Gatsby looked vacantly through a copy of Clay's Economics, starting at the Finnish maid's footsteps that shook the kitchen floor and peering toward the foggy windows now and then as if something alarming was happening outside. Finally, he got up and told me in an uncertain voice that he was going home. Why's that? Nobody's coming to tea. It's too late. He looked at his watch as if there was some pressing demand on his time elsewhere. I can't wait all day. Don't be silly, it's just 2 minutes to 4. He sat down miserably as if I had pushed him, and just then, we heard a car turning into my lane. We both jumped up, and a little nervous myself, I went out into the yard. Under the dripping lilac trees, a large open car was coming up the drive. It stopped. Daisy's face tipped sideways beneath a lavender hat, looked out at me with a bright, excited smile. Is this absolutely where you live, my dearest one? The exhilarating sound of her voice was a wild tonic in the rain. I had to follow the sound of it for a moment up and down with my ear alone before any words came through. A damp streak of hair lay like a dash of blue paint across her cheek, and her hand was wet with drops as I took it to help her from the car. Are you in love with me? She said low in my ear, or why did I have to come alone? That's the secret of Castle Rackrent. Tell your driver to go far away and come back in an hour. Come back in an hour, Ferdy. Then in a grave murmur, his name is Ferdy. Does the gasoline affect his nose? I don't think so, she said innocently. Why? We went in. To my surprise, the living room was empty. Well, that's funny, I exclaimed. What's funny? She turned her head as there was a light knock at the front door. I went out and opened it. Gatsby, pale as death with his hands in his coat pockets, was standing in a puddle of water glaring tragically into my eyes. With his hands still in his pockets, he walked by me into the hall, turned sharply as if he were on a wire, and disappeared into the living room. It wasn't funny at all. Aware of my heart beating loudly, I closed the door against the increasing rain. For half a minute, there was no sound. Then from the living room, I heard a sort of choking murmur and part of a laugh followed by Daisy's voice in a clear, artificial tone. I certainly am glad to see you again. A pause. It lasted horribly. I had nothing to do in the hall, so I went into the room. Gatsby, his hands still in his pockets, was leaning against the mantelpiece in a strained imitation of ease and boredom. His head leaned back so far that it rested against the face of an old mantelpiece clock. From this position, his worried eyes stared down at Daisy, who was sitting, frightened but graceful, on the edge of a stiff chair. We've met before, muttered Gatsby. His eyes glanced at me, and his lips tried to form a laugh. Luckily, the clock tilted dangerously at the pressure of his head, and he caught it with trembling fingers, setting it back in place. Then he sat down stiffly, his elbow on the arm of the sofa and his chin in his hand. I'm sorry about the clock, he said. My own face had turned red. I couldn't think of a single ordinary thing to say. It's an old clock, I told them idiotically. I think we all believed for a moment that it had smashed into pieces on the floor. We haven't met for many years, said Daisy, her voice as matter-of-fact as it could be. 5 years next November. The automatic quality of Gatsby's answer set us all back another minute. I had them both on their feet with the desperate suggestion that they help me make tea in the kitchen when the maid brought it in on a tray. Amid the welcome confusion of cups and cakes, a certain physical decency established itself. Gatsby got into a shadow, and while Daisy and I talked, he looked from one to the other of us with tense, unhappy eyes. However, as calmness wasn't the goal, I made an excuse at the first possible moment and got to my feet. "Where are you going?" demanded Gatsby in immediate alarm. "I'll be back. I've got to speak to you about something before you go." He followed me wildly into the kitchen, closed the door, and whispered, "Oh God," in a miserable way. "What's the matter?" "This is a terrible mistake," he said, shaking his head. "A terrible, terrible mistake. You're just embarrassed, that's all," I said. "Daisy's embarrassed too." "She's embarrassed?" he repeated incredulously. "Just as much as you are." "Don't talk so loud. You're acting like a little boy," I said impatiently. "Not only that, but you're rude. Daisy's sitting in there all alone." He raised his hand to stop my words, looked at me with unforgettable reproach, and cautiously went back into the other room. I walked out the back way, just as Gatsby had when he had nervously walked around the house half an hour before, and ran for a huge tree with knotted branches. The leaves made a cover against the rain. Once more, it was pouring, and my irregular lawn, well trimmed by Gatsby's gardener, was full of small muddy swamps. There was nothing to look at from under the tree except Gatsby's enormous house, so I stared at it like Kant at his church steeple for half an hour. A brewer had built it early in the period craze a decade before, and there was a story that he'd agreed to pay 5 years' taxes on all the neighboring cottages if the owners would thatch their roofs with straw. Perhaps their refusal took the heart out of his plan to found a family. He went into an immediate decline. His children sold his house with the black wreath still on the door. Americans, while willing, even eager to be servants, have always been stubborn about being peasants. After half an hour, the sun shone again, and the grocer's car rounded Gatsby's drive with supplies for his servants' dinner. I felt sure he wouldn't eat a spoonful. A maid began opening the upper windows of his house, appeared momentarily in each, and leaned from the large central bay, spitting into the garden. It was time I went back. While the rain continued, it had seemed like the murmur of their voices rising and swelling with gusts of emotion. But in the new silence, I felt that silence had fallen within the house too. I went in, after making every possible noise in the kitchen short of pushing over the stove, but I don't believe they heard a sound. They were sitting at either end of the couch, looking at each other as if some question had been asked. All the embarrassment was gone. Daisy's face was smeared with tears, and when I came in, she jumped up and began wiping at it with her handkerchief in front of a mirror. But there was a change in Gatsby that was simply amazing. He literally glowed. Without a word or a gesture, a new well-being radiated from him and filled the little room. "Oh, hello, old sport," he said as if he hadn't seen me for years. I thought for a moment he was going to shake hands. "It's stopped raining, has it?" When he realized what I was talking about, that there were beams of sunshine in the room, he smiled like a weatherman and repeated the news to Daisy. "What do you think of that?" "It's stopped raining. I'm glad, Jay." Her voice, full of emotion, told only of her unexpected joy. "I want you and Daisy to come over to my house," he said. "I'd like to show her around." "You're sure you want me to come?" "Absolutely, old sport." Daisy went upstairs to wash her face, too late, I thought with humiliation about my towels, while Gatsby and I waited on the lawn. "My house looks well, doesn't it?" he demanded. "See how the whole front of it catches the light." I agreed that it was splendid. "Yes." His eyes went over every arched door and square tower. "It took me just 3 years to earn the money that bought it." "I thought you inherited your money." "I did, old sport," he said automatically, but I lost most of it in the big panic, the panic of the war. I think he hardly knew what he was saying because when I asked him what business he was in, he answered, "That's my affair," before he realized it wasn't the right reply. "Oh, I've been in several things," he corrected himself. "I was in the drug business and then in the oil business. But I'm not in either one now." He looked at me more closely. "Do you mean you've been thinking over what I proposed the other night?" Before I could answer, Daisy came out of the house, and 2 rows of brass buttons on her dress gleamed in the sunlight. "That huge place there?" she cried, pointing. "Do you like it?" "I love it, but I don't see how you live there all alone. I keep it always full of interesting people, night and day. People who do interesting things. Famous people." Instead of taking the shortcut along the Sound, we went down to the road and entered by the big gate. With soft murmurs, Daisy admired this or that aspect of the feudal silhouette against the sky, admired the gardens, the smell of jonquils, hawthorn, plum blossoms, and kissed me at the gate. It was strange to reach the marble steps and find no stir of bright dresses in and out the door and hear no sound but birds in the trees. Inside, as we wandered through Marie Antoinette music rooms and restoration salons, I felt there were guests hidden behind every couch and table, ordered to be silent until we had passed through. As Gatsby closed the door of the Merton College Library, I could have sworn I heard the owl-eyed man break into ghostly laughter. We went upstairs through bedrooms swathed in rose and lavender silk and vivid with new flowers, through dressing rooms and pool rooms and bathrooms with sunken baths. In one room, a man in pajamas was doing exercises on the floor. It was Mr. Klipspringer, the boarder. I had seen him wandering about the beach that morning. Finally, we came to Gatsby's own apartment, a bedroom, a bath, and a study where we sat down and drank a glass of chartreuse he took from a cupboard in the wall. He hadn't stopped looking at Daisy, and I think he revalued everything in his house according to her reaction. Sometimes he stared around at his possessions in a dazed way as if, in her presence, none of it was real. Once he nearly fell down a flight of stairs. His bedroom was the simplest room of all, except where the dresser was garnished with a set of pure gold. Daisy took the brush with delight and smoothed her hair, whereupon Gatsby sat down, shaded his eyes, and began to laugh. "It's the funniest thing, old sport," he said hilariously. "I can't, when I try to." He had passed visibly through 2 states and was entering a third. After his embarrassment and his unreasoning joy, he was consumed with wonder at her presence. He had been full of the idea for so long, dreamed it right through to the end, waited with intense focus. Now, in the reaction, he was running down like an overwound clock. Recovering himself in a minute, he opened for us 2 large cabinets that held his massed suits, dressing gowns, and ties, and his shirts piled in stacks. "I've got a man in England who buys me clothes. He sends over a selection of things at the beginning of each season, spring and fall." He took out a pile of shirts and began throwing them one by one before us. Shirts of sheer linen, thick silk, and fine flannel, which lost their folds as they fell and covered the table in many-colored disarray. While we admired, he brought more, and the soft, rich heap grew higher, shirts with stripes, scrolls, and plaids in coral, apple green, lavender, and faint orange with monograms of Indian blue. Suddenly, with a strained sound, Daisy bent her head into the shirts and began to cry stormily. "They're such beautiful shirts," she sobbed, her voice muffled in the thick folds. "It makes me sad because I've never seen such beautiful shirts before." After the house, we were to see the grounds, the swimming pool, the hydroplane, and the midsummer flowers. But outside Gatsby's window, it began to rain again, so we stood in a row looking at the surface of the Sound. "If it wasn't for the mist, we could see your home across the bay," said Gatsby. You always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. Daisy put her arm through his suddenly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it occurred to him that the great meaning of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to the distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near, almost touching. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was just a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. I began to walk about the room, looking at various objects in the half-darkness. A large photograph of an elderly man in yachting clothes attracted me. It was hung on the wall over his desk. Who's this? That's Mr. Dan Cody, old sport. The name sounded faintly familiar. He's dead now. He used to be my best friend years ago. There was a small picture of Gatsby also in yachting clothes on the bureau. Gatsby with his head thrown back defiantly, taken apparently when he was about 18. I adore it, exclaimed Daisy. The pompadour. You never told me you had a pompadour, or a yacht. Look at this, said Gatsby quickly. Here's a lot of clippings, about you. They stood side by side, examining it. I was going to ask to see the rubies when the phone rang, and Gatsby picked it up. Yes? Well, I can't talk now. I can't talk now, old sport. I said a small town. He must know what a small town is. Well, he's no use to us if Detroit is his idea of a small town. He hung up. Come here quick, cried Daisy at the window. The rain was still falling, but the darkness had parted in the west, and there was a pink and golden billow of clouds above the sea. Look at that, she whispered, and then after a moment, I'd like to just get one of those pink clouds and put you in it and push you around. I tried to go then, but they wouldn't hear of it. Perhaps my presence made them feel more alone together. I know what we'll do, said Gatsby. We'll have Klipspringer play the piano. He went out of the room, calling, Ewing, and returned in a few minutes with an embarrassed, slightly worn young man with shell-rimmed glasses and thin blonde hair. He was now dressed in a sport shirt, open at the neck, sneakers, and light pants. Did we interrupt your exercise? Asked Daisy politely. I was asleep, cried Mr. Klipspringer, embarrassed. That is, I'd been asleep. Then I got up. Klipspringer plays the piano, said Gatsby, cutting him off. Don't you, Ewing, old sport? I don't play well. I don't hardly play at all. I'm all out of practice. We'll go downstairs, interrupted Gatsby. He flipped a switch. The gray windows disappeared as the house glowed with light. In the music room, Gatsby turned on a lamp beside the piano. He lit Daisy's cigarette from a trembling match and sat down with her on a couch far across the room where there was no light except what the floor reflected from the hall. When Klipspringer had played The Love Nest, he turned around on the bench and looked for Gatsby in the gloom. I'm all out of practice, you see. I told you I couldn't play. I'm all out of prac. Don't talk so much, old sport, commanded Gatsby. Play. In the morning. In the evening. Ain't we got fun? Outside, the wind was loud, and there was a faint roll of thunder along the sound. All the lights were coming on in West Egg now. The electric trains carrying men were heading home through the rain from New York. It was the hour of a deep human change, and excitement was in the air. One thing's sure and nothing's surer. The rich get richer and the poor get children. In the meantime, in between time, as I went over to say goodbye, I saw that the bewildered look had come back to Gatsby's face as if he had a faint doubt about his happiness. Almost 5 years. There must have been moments even that afternoon when Daisy fell short of his dreams. Not through her own fault but because of the great intensity of his illusion. It had gone beyond her, beyond everything. He had thrown himself into it with creative passion, adding to it all the time, decorating it with every bright feather that drifted his way. No amount of fire or freshness can compete with what a man can store up in his ghostly heart. As I watched him, he adjusted himself a little visibly. His hand took hold of hers, and as she said something low in his ear, he turned toward her with a rush of emotion. I think that voice held him most with its fluctuating feverish warmth because it couldn't be overdreamed. That voice was a deathless song. They had forgotten me, but Daisy glanced up and held out her hand. Gatsby didn't know me now at all. I looked once more at them, and they looked back at me, deeply absorbed in each other. Then I went out of the room and down the marble steps into the rain, leaving them there together.